Hello, everyone. So this is my sort of part that I'm going to be talking about right now. And I want to share with you all my 1882 education team experience, or in other words, what I've learned from lessons in Japanese American incarceration. So first, a brief overview of just, the work I've done for the education team this summer. I had the pleasure of creating three lesson plans, all pretty interconnected. They're all related to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Specifically, I produced a lesson plan on Frank Emmy and the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee. I produced a second lesson plan on James Omura and the Rocky Shinpo newspaper. And finally, I produced a third lesson on the Japanese American Citizens League. You can see on the right, I have all three of my lesson plans pictured. I just took screenshots of the headers to give you like a brief idea of what the content consists of. Each of my lesson plans follows a pretty similar format. It first has this like background introduction section, just sort of explaining who this person was or what this organization was, and like a sort of chronology of the history that is attached to them. And then for the actual activity portions, I collated a bunch of excerpts from writings they've done, either like textual examples. So for example, for the Japanese American Citizens League lesson, I I put a speech that was made by one of the executive leaders of the organization back in the 40s. And then related to that, sort of following the textual sample, I would then pose what I consider some thought-provoking questions that are designed to get the students to really think about what this particular document or speech belies about um, what this person organization is like holds to be like a steadfast value, trying to sort of explore general societal trends of the time, those kinds of questions like that I hope are engaging and also informative, or rather uh like I put thought provoking. So just to give you a better idea of what exactly is in each of my lessons, I have attached an example activity here. So, and I've also put a diagram on the side to sort of explain what each part of this is. So first, I have this, fancy schmancy title, a case study of pathos and publications. By the way, this is the third activity for my James O'Mora lesson. For background, James Omura was the English language editor for Rocky Shimpo. So I had a abundance of rec records and um, samples of text that I could use for this. And so I chose to use um, this editorial from his newspaper. I have a brief explainer, kind of contextualizing what it is. I obviously attached the excerpt itself, and then I have some questions on the bottom. And so I hope I don't really need to read all of them out loud, but question number two, for example, like what do you notice about the wording in this excerpt compared to previous ones from 3 years prior? Those are previous activities. Do you think this change of tone is warranted and or compelling? So these are the type of questions that I think the style of questions that I like to ask are kind of like complementary. So first I have like a sort of basic one, like what do you notice about the wording? Oh, it might be that it's very impassioned, it's very accusatory against the current presidential administration. And then do you think this change of tone is warranted and or compelling? And then, the student would then have to decide that for themselves, and it can really teach them about how for this specific lesson, the the sort of like tenets of editorial journalism. Um, yeah. So you might be asking, you might be wondering, where do they get the inspiration to make these lessons and focus so, I guess, squarely on this specific chapter of history? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Last semester, so I'm a rising junior right now. Last semester, my sophomore spring, I had the pleasure of taking this class called Intro to Asian American Studies. It's a very unassuming name, but it was genuinely one of the best classes I've ever taken. And for a week, uh, we focused on this area of history. We read this collection of diaries and diary entries and essays from various uh, uh, incarcerated Japanese Americans who wrote down their experiences at the camps. And we also watched this documentary called Conscience and the Constitution. And this was a very, I would say, impactful documentary for me. It really painted this whole narrative that I had no idea existed at all. It was some, uh, it was a, as the title suggests, Conscience and the Constitution. It was the sort of like constitutional legal litigation aspect of this whole period of Japanese American incarceration. You can see Frank Emmy's pictured on the front. He features prominently as well as James Amora and of course the Japanese American Citizens League. Um, and I think what was so compelling about this documentary was that the sort of quote unquote real history of the camps was so much more complicated. I think before watching it, I just assumed that Japanese Americans kind of um, acquiesced to the orders to relocate, but I wasn't at all aware that there was this sort of civil resistance movement, and that's kind of what this documentary is about. And so I thought it would be a great basis off of which to teach. Um, sort of ideas of like civic advocacy, civil rights, that things I think that are important for students in like government classes to learn about. So I'm going to talk briefly about the process of actually making one of my lessons. So first and foremost, you got to read up on the history. I have three sources listed here. Densho Encyclopedia is uh, probably the most useful and well known of the sources you could use for any sort of education on Japanese American incarceration. It's an encyclopedia dedicated to chronicling all of the various things you would want to know. So they have a page on the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, um, which I absolutely cited for my Frank Emmy lesson. And then I would sort of jot down any takeaways I had on the notes app, and then I would back like back form questions from those notes. Um, I like to think that my questions were pretty similar to those that to the sort of discussions that I had in my Introduction to American Studies class, which I mean to be like, I hope they were thought-provoking because I thought that class was incredibly thought-provoking. And of course, I'd organize my ideas into activities. Um, I will say the most, I guess, the toughest part of this whole process was scouring the Library of Congress website for specific Rocky Shimpo newspaper clippings. And that took quite a while. There was no easy way to sort of pinpoint any one piece of editorial content I wanted. I had to kind of go issue by issue. I guess I was fortunate enough that the Library of Congress had uh, sort of digitized all of these issues, but it was a pretty tedious process. And condensing information, trying to choose which key takeaways I wanted students to learn was also pretty tough. So student takeaways. What about my takeaways? Like, what did I learn from this whole process? All in all, I think it was pretty. It was tough, but it was very rewarding. I really got a sense of like appreciation for the work that teachers put into making sure that students can not only learn about the things that they should be learning about, but also in a manner that allows it to kind of stick in their heads, kind of like stick with them the as it stuck with me after my Introduction to American Studies class. Um, Reflecting on this a bit more, I think for some areas of improvement, I should have recognized that this sort of chapter of history needs a lot more than three lessons. Like there was the whole post-war redress movement, trying to get monetary compensation for still living former internees of the camps. There's also the Heart Mountain Sentinel, that was a newspaper at one of the camps. And so there's a lot of information that it didn't end up using as material for lessons that I think, given enough time and enough sort of like yeah, actually just given enough time, I could have definitely developed into more lessons. And I also recognized that I uniquely kind of focused on this one area of history where I could have branched out to any one of the various aspects of Asian American history that my colleagues and my fellow interns have talked about. But you know, all in all, I thought it was a wonderful experience. It really, gave me greater insight into how this whole educational process works. And on this slide, you may be wondering who are these pictures. The top picture, that is of Mr. Bradford Pearson. He's an author who wrote a book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. It's about the experiences of the incarcerated Japanese Americans at that camp, and I thought be a fitting way to sort of put this on the last slide. And then on the bottom, that's a picture of Mr. Franklin Odo, who is a Japanese American um, activist. He has done a lot of work with 1882, and actually, he uh, has been a great help to me. I personally sort of talked with him about sort of like refining the lessons. And so this presentation and the lessons, of course, could not have come about as a result of if not if he hadn't uh, offered his help. And yeah, so it's my presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed.